Every parent's worst nightmare became 8-year-old Annie's daily reality. She was completely alone in a world that didn't care if she lived or died. When hunger is a constant ache in your belly, and the winter wind bites right through your only dress, desperation makes you brave. It makes you do things that would send grown men running for the hills. Annie stood on the porch of the most dangerous man in Ember Creek. A giant of a man named Jonas Redwood, who hadn't shown an ounce of kindness to a single soul in 3 long years. Folks around town whispered he could snap a man's neck with his bare hands. They said his heart had turned to solid stone after he lost everything that ever mattered to him. But this little girl, with her patched-up shoes and eyes that never wavered, looked straight up at this monster of a man. And she said 5 simple words that would change both their lives forever. "Mister, I can cook and clean." What Jonas saw in that moment wasn't just another starving orphan begging at his door. He saw something else, something that stirred memories he'd buried 6 feet deep. The autumn wind carried dust down Main Street like 1,000 whispered secrets, swirling around the boots of anyone brave enough to be outside in Ember Creek. This wasn't a town you'd find on any map to be proud of. It was just a handful of sun-bleached buildings huddled together against the vast Montana wilderness, like they were afraid of the endless sky. The sun cast long, hungry shadows between the general store, the saloon, and Doc Peterson's office. And in the distance, the mountains stood like silent giants, watching over dreams that had turned as dusty as the streets. Jonas Redwood's cabin sat a quarter-mile past the last flickering oil lamp of town, out where the prairie grass grew tall and the only sound was the cry of a hawk. 3 years ago, he'd called this isolation a sanctuary. Now, it was just a prison he'd built for himself, though he'd die before he admitted that to the ghosts that shared it with him. At 6'4", with shoulders wide enough to carry the weight of the world, Jonas made other men step aside without even thinking. His hands, scarred from ranch work and bar fights, could gentle a spooked horse or break a man's jaw with the same chilling efficiency. But those same hands trembled now, just a little, as he poured his morning whiskey. The amber liquid caught the grimy light, and for a moment, it looked like liquid fire. The folks in Ember Creek had long memories and even longer tongues. They remembered when Jonas Redwood was the best ranch foreman in 3 counties, a man who could tame the wildest cattle and turn a failing spread into a gold mine. They remembered his wedding day, when he married sweet Helena Morrison. The whole town turned out, talking about true love and how some men get a second chance at happiness. They remembered the way his whole face lit up when Helena told him a baby was on the way. He started building a crib with his own 2 hands, working by lamplight after 14 hours on the range. But mostly, they remembered the fire. Nobody spoke of it, not where Jonas could hear. The story had been whispered so many times it had become a legend, each telling making it worse than the last. Helena had been visiting her sister in the next county. A summer storm rolled in. Lightning struck the house, dry as tinder, and it went up like a torch. By the time Jonas rode back from the cattle drive, there was nothing left. Just a pile of ash and the twisted metal frame of the baby crib he never got to finish. Doc Peterson, the man who delivered half the babies in town, still woke up some nights seeing it. He was the one who had to tell Jonas, had to tell him Helena was gone, and their unborn son with her. He watched a good man shatter into a million pieces right in front of him. All that strength, all that gentleness, twisted into something dark. That's when the drinking started. That's when Jonas started settling arguments with his fists. That's when he moved to the edge of town, into a prison of his own making, trusting no one. Sheriff Murphy had tried to help. He was a practical man, with 20 years of keeping the peace etched into the lines on his face. He brought food. He offered work. He even suggested talking to the preacher. Jonas turned it all away, retreating deeper into the darkness until even the sheriff gave up. The only one who didn't give up was Mrs. Brennan, who ran the general store with the heart of a mother hen. She'd bring supplies every few weeks and leave them on his porch. A jar of her preserves, a fresh loaf of bread. She told herself it was just Christian charity. But really, she remembered the man Jonas used to be, and she couldn't quite bring herself to believe he was gone forever. On this particular morning, as Annie Mae walked toward that isolated cabin, Mrs. Brennan saw her from her store window. She saw the purpose in the little girl's stride. Children in Ember Creek learned young which folks were safe and which to avoid. This little girl was walking straight into the lion's den, and she was walking like she had no other choice in the world. Annie Mae Fitzgerald had turned 8 years old, 2 months before the fever took her parents. Her father, a mining engineer from back east, had filled her head with stories of promise and rich land. Her mother, gentle and practical, had filled her hands with skills, teaching her to cook and clean and run a house like a grown woman. They were a family that believed in hard work and the goodness of people. The fever taught Annie a different lesson. For 6 weeks after she buried them, she survived on charity. But charity in a frontier town runs out fast. Kindness often came with a price that made her skin crawl. So she learned to sleep in barns. She learned to find food where others saw none. She learned to read faces, to see the rot behind a sweet smile. She developed an instinct for danger that kept her alive when other orphans simply vanished. And that same instinct told her something surprising. It told her that Jonas Redwood, for all his terrifying reputation, was not the kind of man who would hurt a child. The whispers were always about bar fights, about grown men's business. Never once had she heard a story of him being cruel to the weak or the innocent. In a world full of smiling monsters, Jonas's honest brutality felt safer. She'd watched him for 3 days. She saw him split wood with a brutal mechanical rhythm. She saw him tend to his horse with a surprising gentleness. She saw a man who had built walls around himself, not to keep the world out, but to keep his own pain in. So she stood on his porch, her small fist raised to knock. In her pocket was everything she owned, her mother's water-damaged recipe book. It was more than recipes. It was memories. It was survival. When Jonas finally swung the door open, he was everything she expected. A mountain of a man with eyes like a winter storm. But what she hadn't expected was the flicker of recognition in those eyes. As if he saw something in her he thought was gone forever. "Mister," she said, her voice rock steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I can cook and clean. I need work, and I heard you might need help." Jonas just stared. He was used to being left alone. The rhythm of his days was marked by the sun and the level of whiskey in his bottle. This small girl, standing there with more dignity than the town mayor, was a disruption he didn't know how to process. "I don't need help," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "And I don't have money for wages." She had expected that. She'd rehearsed this on the long walk out. "I don't need much," she said. "Just a place to sleep and food to eat. I can earn my keep. I promise. My mama taught me to cook real food, not just beans and hardtack. And I know how to clean proper, how to make a place feel like home." That word, home. It hit Jonas like a punch to the gut. He'd been living in this cabin for 3 years, but it hadn't been a home since Helena's laughter had faded to silence. It was just a place to wait for the next day to dawn, empty and meaningless. "There's nothing here for you," Jonas said, but the words had no force behind them. "No place for a child." Annie looked at his face. She saw the pain he carried, a grief so big it had swallowed him whole. It was a pain she understood. "I don't take up much room," she said simply. "And I won't be any trouble." He wanted to close the door. He wanted to go back to his whiskey and his silence, back to the familiar ache of his solitude. But something in her steady gaze reminded him of Helena, of her quiet strength, her refusal to be afraid. Against every instinct that screamed at him to protect what was left of his shattered heart, Jonas Redwood stepped aside, and he let Annie Mae in. The change started the second she stepped inside.
Annie moved through the filthy cabin with the quiet efficiency of a woman 3 times her age. She didn't comment on the dirt or the emptiness. She just took stock. She found kindling for the stove. She located the meager food supplies Jonas had mostly ignored. And she began the slow, steady process of turning a house back into a home. As the sun climbed higher, casting clean light through windows Annie had scrubbed spotless, Jonas just watched her. He couldn't remember the last time the cabin had been warm. The last time the smell of food had filled the air. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had anything to look forward to. One night, he said finally, his voice gruff, hiding emotions he refused to name. "You can stay one night, then we'll figure out what's next." Annie smiled then.
The first real smile that had touched her lips since she'd buried her parents. And in that moment, Jonas felt a crack appear in the thick ice that had encased his heart for 3 long years. He told himself it was nothing, just a momentary thaw. But somewhere deep inside him, a warmth began to spread that he had thought was lost to him forever. Outside, the wind still howled, carrying dust and secrets through the streets of Ember Creek. But inside Jonas Redwood's cabin, something new was taking root. Something neither of them understood, but both of them desperately needed. Dawn crept across the Montana sky, painting the horizon in shades of amber and rose that Jonas hadn't noticed in years. The first thing that hit him wasn't the usual throbbing in his head, but a smell. The smell of coffee brewing, and bacon sizzling in a pan. For a second, he thought he was dreaming. He was so used to waking up alone, to the dead silence of his self-imposed prison. But the gentle sounds of someone moving in his kitchen were real. Then he remembered. The girl. The small girl with the old eyes who'd shown up at his door. He sat up on his cot, running a hand through his matted hair. Annie was at his stove, her bare feet silent on the wood floor. She moved like she'd been doing this her whole life. "Good morning, Mr. Redwood," she said, without even turning around. "I hope you don't mind. I started breakfast, found some eggs that were still good and a bit of bacon that just needed the mold cut off." Jonas stared. She was wearing the same patched dress, now smudged with grease, her hair braided neatly. She had to use both hands to lift his heavy cast-iron skillet, but she did it with a practiced confidence that was almost unnerving. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" he grumbled, his voice still thick with sleep. She glanced over her shoulder, a shy smile touching her lips. "My mama," she said. "She always said a woman who can cook will never go hungry, and a woman who can cook well will always have a place in the world." Her smile faded a little. "She had a recipe book. Her grandmother gave it to her. I saved it when—" She stopped, turning back to the bacon. Jonas knew that silence. He lived in it. The silence that follows a loss so big, you have to cut your sentences short to walk around it. "I'd like to see that book sometime," he said, the words surprising him as much as they did her. Her whole face lit up. "Really? It's got everything. How to make bread that rises proper. How to cure meat so it keeps. Even how to make medicine from wild plants." She flipped the bacon perfectly. "Mama said the recipes were just the start. The real cooking happens when you learn to make food taste like love." The words hit him like a physical blow. Helena had said something just like that, laughing at him as he fumbled with pie dough in their kitchen. "Food is just fuel, Jonas," she'd said. "But cooking is how you show people they matter." Annie served him breakfast on the cleanest plate she could find. The eggs were perfect. The bacon was crisp. She'd even found some wild herbs growing outside the door to season them. He ate in silence, every bite a reminder of how long it had been since he'd tasted anything but whiskey and despair. For 3 years, he'd eaten cold beans from a can, stale bread. This simple meal felt like a resurrection. "It's good," he said. The 2 words felt heavy, inadequate, but true. Annie beamed. Mama said the secret is timing. Most folks cook too fast. They don't give the flavors time to get acquainted. After breakfast, she started to clean. Not with a lot of noise or chatter, just a quiet, methodical restoration of order. Jonas watched, feeling a strange mix of amazement and discomfort. She found things he'd forgotten he even owned. Books Helena had loved, a carved wooden box that had been his father's, and a photograph he had hidden away years ago, because looking at it was like pressing a hot knife to his heart. Annie picked it up. It was him and Helena on their wedding day, both of them so young, so full of hope it was painful to see. She held it for a long moment, her small fingers tracing the frame. Then she gently wiped it clean and set it on the dusty mantelpiece. "She was beautiful," Annie said softly. "You both look so happy." Jonas stared at the picture, truly seeing it for the first time since the fire. He braced for the usual wave of rage and pain, but it didn't come. Instead, there was just a sweet, deep ache, an ache that was more love than loss. "She was," he said, his voice quiet. "Beautiful and kind. Too good for a man like me." Annie considered this with the solemn gravity of a judge. "My mama used to say that when people love us, they see the things in us we can't see ourselves. Maybe your Helena saw exactly the kind of man you are." The simple wisdom of it stole his breath. This child, who had lost everything, still held on to a belief in goodness that his own grief had burned to ash. He had surrounded himself with walls of anger and bitterness. She had walked right through them without even trying. She spent the morning telling him stories about her mother as she worked, about learning to bake bread while standing on a crate, about gathering berries and learning which plants could heal and which could kill. Each story was a precious memory, polished smooth with retelling. "Mama could make anything feel special," Annie said, sweeping dust from corners that hadn't seen a broom in years. "She said every object has a history. It was our job to respect them, because we were just borrowing them for a little while." Jonas found himself listening, really listening, for the first time in a long time. There was a healing in her words, a way of holding on to love without drowning in loss. "What about your father?" he asked. Her face grew thoughtful. "Papa was different, quieter. He was a mining engineer back east. He knew about rocks and metals, how to find valuable things hidden in the ground." She started sweeping again, a little faster this time. "He taught me to read maps. Said knowledge was the only thing no one could ever take from you." There was something in her tone. A shadow. A story not yet told. But Jonas didn't push. He was learning that Annie, like him, had secrets she would only share when she was ready. By noon, the cabin was transformed. It wasn't just clean. It felt alive. Jonas walked through the small space, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Or rather, like he was finally home after a long, dark journey. "I should go," Annie said, hanging up a dish towel. "You said one night. I don't want to overstay my welcome." The words landed with an unexpected thud in his chest. Sometime during the morning, her quiet presence had become essential. The thought of the cabin returning to its cold, silent state was unbearable. "Where will you go?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. She shrugged, a gesture of someone who had learned not to expect much from the world. "There's always somewhere. Mrs. Brennan at the store might have work. Doc Peterson needs help with his supplies." The thought of her bringing this light, this warmth, into someone else's life sparked a possessive feeling in him that was fierce and surprising. He wanted to keep it. He needed to keep it. "Stay," he said, the word coming out rougher than he intended. "Stay. Another day or two. There's more work needs doing." He fumbled for a practical reason, anything to hide the desperation he felt. "It's foolish to turn away good help." The smile that broke across her face was like the sun coming out from behind a storm cloud. It erased all the premature seriousness and revealed the child underneath. Really? You mean it? Jonas just nodded, not trusting his voice. He told himself it was just practical. But he knew it was a lie. For the first time in 3 years, he'd woken up to something other than emptiness. And he wasn't ready to let it go. That afternoon, she showed him the recipe book. The pages were warped from water, the ink faded, but the handwriting was careful and precise. It was filled with recipes, but also with notes, scraps of family history, and gentle advice. Look, she said, pointing to a page. This is for comfort stew. My great-great-grandmother's recipe. For when times were hard, and a little bit of meat had to feed a lot of people. Jonas looked closer. In the margins, different generations had added their own notes in different handwriting. Mama said recipes are like stories, Annie explained. They get better when people add their own chapters. She traced one of the notes with a small finger. This one says, add extra sage when cooking for someone with a broken heart. It helps the medicine go down easier. Food as medicine. Cooking as healing. It was exactly what she had been doing for him all day. As she started dinner that night, Jonas realized the cabin felt different. It felt bigger. Brighter. He hadn't just gotten a housekeeper. He'd gotten a reason. A reason to face tomorrow. When she served the stew, she placed the photograph of him and Helena on the table, right where the lamplight would catch it. As if his late wife was there with them. It was a small thing, but it meant the world. It was a way of honoring the past without being trapped in it. Thank you, Jonas said when they were done eating. The words meant more than just thanks for the meal. And Annie, with her wise old eyes, knew it. You're welcome, Mr. Redwood, she said. Thank you for letting me stay. Later, as she settled into her bed of blankets by the fire, both of them knew something had shifted. This was no longer a simple bargain between strangers. It was becoming something else. Something fragile, but real. Outside, the wind carried the hint of an approaching storm. But inside the cabin, for the first time in 3 long years, Jonas Redwood fell asleep looking forward to the dawn. 3 days passed. Then 4. A week. The rhythm of their life together settled into something that felt as natural as the turning of the seasons. Jonas woke up not to a hangover, but to the smell of coffee. The cabin wasn't just clean, it was cared for. Annie had a way of fixing things he thought were broken forever. She found his old leather work gloves, stiff and cracked with disuse. She spent a whole evening rubbing oil into them by the fire, her small hands working with a patient determination. These are good gloves, she'd said, holding them up. The kind that get better with age if you take care of them. He watched her, and it was like watching a ghost. Helena had believed the same thing, that anything could be mended with enough patience and care. But where Helena's care was born of love and plenty, Annie's was born of necessity. She knew the value of things because she'd had nothing. On the 4th morning, she made biscuits. Perfect, fluffy biscuits from a sack of flour he'd forgotten he even had. How did you know that flour was still good? He asked, genuinely amazed. She smiled. You smell it first. Bad flour has a sour edge. Then you look for weevils. This was fine, just needed sifting. She pinched a bit between her fingers. Mama taught me most food will tell you what it needs, if you just pay attention. After breakfast, he did something that surprised them both. He asked her to help him fix the fence line that was slowly falling apart. She worked alongside him, handing him tools before he even asked, pulling the wire taut while he hammered. She didn't just help, she learned. Why do you space the posts 8 feet apart? She asked. Any closer, you're wasting wood, he found himself explaining, enjoying the role of teacher. Any farther, the wire sags when the snow gets heavy. She nodded, filing the information away. He was starting to realize her mind was like a steel trap. She wasn't just surviving day to day. She was building a library of knowledge for the future. He told her stories about being a ranch foreman. She told him about helping her father with his surveying work. Papa always said the earth keeps its secrets, she said, letting a handful of dirt run through her fingers. But it leaves clues for people who know how to look. He could tell you where to dig a well just by how the grass grew. The way she spoke of her father, it was a mix of pride and a loss so deep it still ached. He knew that feeling all too well. Sounds like he was a smart man, Jonas said quietly. He was, she said. Mama said he could have made a fortune back east, but he wanted to build something that belonged to us. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. Jonas instinctively moved closer to Annie, his hand resting on the fence hammer. Unexpected visitors were rarely good news. It was Doc Peterson on his old mare, his face a mixture of relief and concern. Jonas, he said with a nod. Then his eyes found the girl. And Miss Annie May. I've been worried about you, child. I'm doing fine, Doc Peterson, Annie said with a formal politeness that seemed far beyond her years. The doctor's experienced eyes took her in. The clean dress, the healthy color in her cheeks. Then he looked at Jonas. He saw the clearer eyes, the tension gone from his shoulders. He saw a man who was sleeping at night and not just drinking. I can see that, Doc Peterson said, a small smile on his face. You look like you've been eating regular. Mr. Redwood has been very kind, Annie said carefully. The doctor looked at Jonas for a long, silent moment. He'd seen this man at his absolute worst, a feral animal consumed by grief. The man standing before him now was someone else entirely. I'm glad to hear it, he said finally. The town's been talking, of course. Folks noticed the smoke from your chimney, saw you in town with the girl. Jonas felt his old defenses rise. If people have something to say, they can say it to my face. Most of what they're saying is good, the doctor assured him. Mrs. Brennan says the girl is polite as can be. Sheriff Murphy noticed you were sober and tipped your hat to his wife. The unspoken message was clear. You're changing, Jonas, and everyone can see it. Annie's been a help, Jonas admitted, unwilling to say more. Doc Peterson smiled, understanding everything Jonas left unsaid. I'm sure she has. He turned to Annie. Your father would be proud of you, child. He always said you had more sense than most grown-ups. Annie's face lit up at the praise, but Jonas saw the flicker of pain that followed. He took a half step closer to her, a protective gesture so subtle even he barely noticed it. We should get back to work, Jonas said, uncomfortable. Fence won't fix itself. Doc Peterson nodded and swung himself back onto his horse. But before he rode off, he paused. Jonas, he said, his voice serious. What you're doing here, it's good, for both of you. Don't let fear of what people might think stop you from doing what's right. After the doctor left, they worked in silence. The conversation had brought something into the open that they had both been avoiding. Their arrangement wasn't normal. A single man and an orphan girl living alone. It was bound to cause trouble. That evening, as Annie cooked dinner, Jonas watched her. The thought of losing her, of being sent back to the silent emptiness, was a physical pain in his chest. Annie, he said as they sat down to eat. If anyone asks, you tell them you're earning your keep, that I'm teaching you ranch skills. She looked up from her plate, her eyes searching his. Is that what I'm doing? Learning skills so I can go work somewhere else? The question caught him completely off guard. He'd been thinking about how to defend their arrangement to others. He hadn't thought about how it sounded to her, like he was already planning for her to leave. He struggled for the right words. I want you to learn things that will help you, no matter what happens. She nodded slowly, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. She was learning to read him, and right now, she could read his fear all too clearly. Later that night, as he lay on his cot, listening to the soft sound of her breathing by the fire, he knew Doc Peterson was right. This was good. This was right. But he also knew that forces beyond his control were gathering. Forces that could tear apart the fragile peace they had built. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying new scents on the air. Scents that smelled an awful lot like trouble. By the end of the first week, the change was impossible for Ember Creek to ignore. Smoke rose from Jonas's chimney all day. Clean laundry flapped on a line that hadn't been used in years. And Jonas himself. He walked straighter. He looked people in the eye. The rage that had simmered just beneath his skin was gone. The talk started in Mrs. Brennan's general store. "It's not natural," declared Mrs. Hutchkins, the blacksmith's wife. "A man like that, alone with a child. No good will come of it." Mrs. Brennan, who'd been quietly thrilled by the change in Jonas, bristled. "That child needed help, Martha, and Jonas gave it to her. There's nothing unnatural about Christian charity." "Charity?" Mrs. Hutchkins sniffed. "Seems to me the help is going the other way. I hear his place is spotless and he's been sober in broad daylight." Sheriff Murphy, who was inspecting a box of ammunition, finally spoke up. "From what I've seen," he said, his voice calm and steady, "they're both benefiting. The child is healthy and cared for, and Jonas is acting like a civilized man for the first time in 3 years." Just then, the bell over the store's door jingled. The conversation died instantly. In walked Jonas Redwood and Annie Mae. A hush fell over the store. Jonas was wearing a clean shirt. His hair was combed. Annie walked beside him with a quiet dignity, her patched dress scrubbed clean. "Good morning, Mrs. Brennan," Annie said, her voice clear and polite. "Mr. Redwood and I need some supplies, if you please." Mrs. Brennan's face softened. "Of course, dear. What can I get for you?" Annie produced a neatly written list. "Flour, salt, and some soap. And Mr. Redwood thought we might look at some fabric if it's not too expensive." Fabric. The word caused a ripple of whispers through the store. Fabric meant new clothes. It meant Jonas was planning for the future. For her future. "Something sturdy for every day," Annie explained, after a quick glance at Jonas for approval. "My dress is getting too small, and Mr. Redwood says a working person needs proper clothes." Jonas just nodded, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on him. By acknowledging her need for a new dress, he was publicly acknowledging his responsibility for her. This wasn't temporary charity anymore. This was something else. As Mrs. Brennan showed them the bolts of calico, Annie's quiet politeness started to win people over. She thanked Mrs. Brennan. She held the door for an elderly woman. She addressed the sheriff with a respect that was genuine. "She's got good manners," the banker's wife admitted after they'd left. "Her parents were decent folk," Mrs. Brennan said. "Hard-working, honest, maybe a bit too trusting about some things." A cryptic comment that she refused to explain. Outside, Jonas loaded the wagon, trying to ignore the stares. "They're all looking at us," Annie observed. "People in small towns always look at something different," Jonas said gruffly. But he knew it was more than that. He was a monster with a reputation. She was an orphan who should be in school. Their story didn't make sense to anyone. Their next stop was Doc Peterson's office. Annie wanted to borrow a book from his small lending library. The doctor greeted them warmly. "Jonas," he said, "you seem to be thriving in your new role." "What role is that?" Jonas asked, his defenses up. The doctor's eyes twinkled. "Why, the role of teacher, of course. A noble calling." The word felt right. Jonas was teaching her about fences and horses, and in return, she was teaching him how to live again. How to feel something other than grief. How to hope. While Annie picked out a book about pioneers, Doc Peterson pulled Jonas aside. "The child is flourishing," he said. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." She's a good worker, Jonas mumbled, uncomfortable with the praise. I'm sure she is, the doctor said, his voice turning serious. But Jonas, people are going to start asking questions about schooling, about the legality of your guardianship. It might be wise to start thinking about answers. The warning hit Jonas like a bucket of ice water. He'd been so focused on getting through each day, he hadn't thought about the future. Annie needed more than food and a roof. She needed a real life. She needed legal protection. What do you suggest? Jonas asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Talk to Sheriff Murphy. Find out what it takes to become her legal guardian. And for God's sake, keep your own house in order. No drinking, no fighting. Nothing they can use against you. The conversation was a brutal reminder of how fragile their world was. He'd grown so attached to her, the thought of someone taking her away was a physical pain. Her well-being had to come first, but it would cost him everything. That night, back at the cabin, he started carving. He hadn't touched his whittling knives since Helena died. He was carving a small wooden doll, his hands remembering the familiar motions, the pleasure of creating something from nothing. It was a gift for Annie, but it was also a promise to himself. A promise to build, not just survive. As he worked watching her read by the fire, he realized something profound. Love doesn't always arrive like a lightning strike. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, disguised as responsibility, disguised as a shared meal, disguised as mending a fence. And then one day you look up, and you can't imagine your life without it. Outside, the wind carried new sounds. The distant rumble of horses. The faint echo of voices arguing over maps and boundaries. Unseen forces were on the move. But inside the cabin, two broken souls were slowly, carefully, building a family. And they were about to discover just how much they were willing to fight to protect it. Annie found the surveyor's map by accident. She was digging through an old trunk of Jonas's, looking for extra blankets as the nights grew colder. Tucked beneath layers of old clothes that smelled of cedar and regret, wrapped in oilcloth, was a rolled-up document. At first, it just looked like any other territorial survey. But as she spread it out on the kitchen table, her eyes, trained by her engineer father, saw things a normal person would miss. Her heart began to pound. "Mr. Redwood!" she called out, her voice a strange mix of excitement and fear. "Could you come look at this?" Jonas came in from the barn, wiping his dusty hands on his trousers. He froze in the doorway when he saw the map. A storm of guilt and memory crossed his face. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice carefully flat. "In the trunk. I was looking for blankets. I'm sorry if I shouldn't have." "It's all right," he said quickly, moving to her side. I haven't looked at that in a long time." She studied his face, her perceptive gaze missing nothing. "Papa taught me how to read these," she said softly. "He said maps tell stories." Her small finger traced a series of symbols marked along a creek bed. "This shows mineral rights, doesn't it? These symbols? They mean someone found valuable deposits." Jonas stared down at the map, at the lines and symbols he had tried so hard to forget. "Your father was a mining engineer," he said, his voice hollow. "He would have known." "He said mineral rights were sometimes more valuable than the land itself," she continued, her finger moving to the section of the map that marked Jonas's own property. "Especially if someone found silver or gold. According to this, there are rich silver deposits right here, right under our feet." The statement hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Jonas sank into a chair looking 10 years older. "Annie," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "how much do you know about how your parents died?" The question caught her off guard. "They died of fever," she said. "Doc Peterson said it was quick." Jonas slowly shook his head. the movement full of a terrible weight. That's the story everyone believes. But it's not the truth, child. Your parents weren't sick when they died. They were murdered. The world tilted on its axis. Annie gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. What? Who? Who would do that? Men who wanted what your father knew, Jonas said, his voice thick with a guilt he'd carried for 3 years. Your father and I, we were partners. Before I met Helena, we found the silver on this land. We filed the claim together, proper and legal. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain she was only just beginning to understand. But filing a claim and holding on to it are 2 different things when there's that much money involved. Her mind was racing, connecting dots she hadn't even known existed. You knew my papa? I knew him well. Thomas Fitzgerald was the best engineer I ever worked with, and the most honest man. Jonas's voice grew rough. When I married Helena, I wanted to settle down, just ranch. Your father bought out my share of the mineral rights. He was going to work the claim, build a good life for you and your mother. But someone else wanted it, Annie whispered, the horror dawning. Jonas nodded grimly. Men with more money and no conscience. They tried to buy him out cheap. He refused. They tried to challenge the claim in court. That didn't work. So they killed him. And your mother. They made it look like a fever so no one would ask questions. He clenched his scarred fists. But I knew. Your father sent me a letter just days before. He told me about the threats. He was scared, Annie. But he was stubborn. He wouldn't give up what was his. She stared at him, the accusation in her eyes as sharp as a knife. Why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you help him? The question tore him apart. I tried, he choked out. I rode out to your place as soon as I got the letter. But I was too late. They were already gone. And so were you. I looked for you for weeks, Annie. I asked everyone. But you had just vanished. I was hiding, she said, the memory hitting her like a physical blow. Papa told me if anything happened, I should run and hide. I stayed in the woods for almost a week. Jonas reached across the table, his hand covering hers. I'm sorry, Annie. I failed him, and I failed you. You couldn't have saved them, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. Papa always said you can't fight greed with good intentions. She looked from his face back to the map. Mr. Redwood, if you and Papa were partners, and he bought your share, what does that mean now that he's gone? This was the question he had been dreading. Legally, he said slowly, the rights should pass to you. You're his only heir. But proving that in a territorial court, against the men who killed him, it would take evidence we just don't have. So they get away with it, she said, bitterness creeping into her voice. They kill my parents and get rich from it. The look on her face. It was the same rage he had felt after losing Helena. The rage that had almost destroyed him, but her arrival had given him a reason to fight back. Maybe not, he said, an idea starting to form. Your father was meticulous. He kept records of everything. Annie's eyes lit up with a sudden memory. He did. He kept everything in a special strongbox. He said important papers were like gold. You guard them with your life. Jonas felt a jolt of hope. Do you know what happened to that strongbox? She looked thoughtful. I hid it. The night it happened. Papa told me to take it and the recipe book and run. I buried it. In the woods near our old place. Under a lightning-struck oak tree. The knowledge hit Jonas like a thunderclap. The evidence might still exist. We need to get that box, he said, his voice filled with a new and dangerous determination. But those men, she said, fear finally showing in her eyes. If they killed Papa and Mama, they'll try to kill us too. Jonas looked at the child before him. This brave, broken, beautiful child. For 3 years he had run from violence. He had hidden from the world. But this was different. This wasn't about his pain anymore. This was about justice. It was about protecting her. "Let them try," he said, his voice as cold and hard as iron. "Your father trusted me. I failed him once. I will not fail you now." That night, Jonas cleaned and oiled his father's old Colt revolver. Violence had taken everything from him. Now, he would use it to take something back. Annie watched him, her face solemn. "Papa used to say some fights choose you, whether you want them or not." "Your father was a wise man," Jonas replied, "and he raised a daughter with his courage and her mother's heart." As they made their plans, neither of them saw the lone rider watching the cabin from a distant hill. They didn't see the glint of sunlight off the lens of a spyglass. The map had revealed more than just silver. It had revealed a secret that powerful men had killed to protect. And they were not about to let a broken man and an orphan girl bring it all to light. The riders came at dawn. Not thugs in dusty clothes, but 3 men in expensive suits, their city clothes looking alien against the raw Montana landscape. With them was a territorial marshal, his badge a cold star of authority on his chest. Jonas saw them coming. His hand went to the rifle he now kept leaning against the wall, cleaned and loaded for the first time in years. "Annie," he said, his voice low and calm, his eyes fixed on the approaching horseman. "Remember what we talked about. Stay quiet. Let me do the talking." She came to stand beside him, her small hand finding his. She was wearing the new dress they'd bought, her hair neatly braided. She looked like a daughter, not a stray. That might be the only thing that kept them alive. "Are those them?" she whispered. "The men who hurt Papa?" "I don't know yet," Jonas said. "But they're here about the land. That much is certain." The lead rider dismounted with the easy arrogance of a man who always got what he wanted. He was maybe 50, well-fed, with the soft hands of someone who pays other men to do his dirty work. He walked to the door, his men flanking him like wolves. The knock was firm, authoritative. The sound of a man who believes the law is on his side because he bought it. Jonas opened the door, his large frame filling the doorway. Annie stood just behind him, a silent shadow. He let them see the rifle in his hand. Not pointing, just present. A reminder that this conversation could go several ways. "Mr. Redwood," the lead man said, his smile never touching his cold eyes. "My name is Harrison Blackwood. I represent certain business interests that have a legal claim to this property. I believe it's time we had a talk." Jonas looked him over. The expensive suit, the manicured nails, the way his eyes flickered to Annie, not with sympathy, but with calculation. This was a predator who used paper instead of claws. "I've got legal title to this land," Jonas said, his voice a low rumble. "Filed and paid for. What claim do you think you have?" Blackwood produced a leather portfolio and withdrew a sheaf of official-looking documents. "I'm afraid there are irregularities in your original filing. Mineral rights that were never properly transferred. Survey boundaries that overlap prior claims." He smiled that cold smile again. "My clients have been very patient." The thin, nervous marshal stepped forward. "Mr. Redwood, these gentlemen have filed a formal challenge to your land claim. Until the matter is resolved in court, you're requested to vacate the premises." "Requested?" Jonas repeated, a dangerous edge to his voice. "Am I under legal obligation to leave my own home based on some papers I've never seen?" The marshal shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, not an obligation. But Mr. Blackwood's clients have significant resources. It might be easier for everyone if I just walked away," Jonas finished for him. "Hand over my home and my land to men I've never met." Blackwood's smile tightened. "Mr. Redwood, surely we can be reasonable. My clients are prepared to offer fair compensation for your improvements. You and the child would be free to go. The casual way he said the child sent a chill down Jonas's spine. They knew who she was. They knew everything. And if I refuse your generous offer? Jonas asked. Then we proceed through legal channels, Blackwood said smoothly. Courts are expensive, Mr. Redwood. Time-consuming. A man like you could find himself bankrupt long before a judge ever bangs a gavel. The threat was unmistakable. They would bury him in paper. They would ruin him financially until he had no choice but to surrender. It was a tactic that had likely worked 100 times before. I'll need time to review these documents, Jonas said finally, and consult with a lawyer. Blackwood's smirk said he knew Jonas didn't have a lawyer. Of course. Take all the time you need. We'll return in 1 week for your answer. After they left, Jonas spread the documents on the table. They looked real. Official seals, dense legal language. It was a masterpiece of fraud. It's all lies, Annie said, her voice shaking with anger. Papa filed everything proper. He showed me. They're trying to steal what belongs to us. Jonas felt a fierce pride swell in his chest. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter, and she had said us. You're right, he said, but proving it against their money and their crooked judges won't be easy. Then what do we do? She asked, her eyes searching his. He looked at her, and all the rage he'd held onto for 3 years finally found a purpose. It wasn't about his grief anymore. It was about her future. It was about her parents' memory. We get that strong box, he said, his voice hard as granite. We find every piece of paper your father left. And then we make these men prove their lies in broad daylight, where everyone can see them for the murdering thieves they are. That evening, Jonas finished carving the wooden doll. He sanded it smooth, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. As he worked, Annie sat by the fire, practicing her letters in a notebook. Annie, he said, holding out the finished doll. I want you to have this. Her face lit up with a pure, childish delight that he rarely saw. She took the doll, turning it over in her hands. It was simple, but carved with a love he hadn't known he was still capable of. She's beautiful, she breathed. Thank you, Mr. Redwood. I want you to know, Jonas said, the words feeling heavy and important. No matter what happens with all this, you have a place with me. You're not just earning your keep anymore, Annie. You're family. Tears welled in her eyes. You mean it? Really and truly? Really and truly, he confirmed. If you'll have me, I'd like to be your guardian, legal and proper, the way your parents would have wanted. She threw her arms around his neck, clutching him tightly, the wooden doll held safe in her other hand. Yes, she whispered fiercely into his shoulder. Yes, I want that more than anything. In that moment, they both knew the stakes had changed. This wasn't about land anymore. It was about the right to be a family, a right they would now have to fight for with their lives. Outside, the storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and menacing. And somewhere in that darkness, Harrison Blackwood was planning his next move. He was done with legal niceties. He was done with warnings. He was ready to finish what he'd started 3 years ago. The attack came 2 nights before Blackwood's deadline, under a sky as black as a closing grave. Jonas woke to the sound of shattering glass and the sharp, oily smell of smoke. Years of frontier living had his instincts screaming before he was even fully awake. Annie! He yelled, rolling off his cot and grabbing the rifle that was now his constant companion. Get down! Stay low! The night exploded. Gunfire erupted from all sides of the cabin, muzzle flashes like angry fireflies in the dark. He could see shapes moving outside. 4, maybe 5 of them. The smell of coal oil was stronger now. They'd set the barn on fire. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. This was an execution. Annie crawled across the floor toward him. her small form silhouetted against the growing orange glow from the windows. She was clutching the wooden doll he'd made her. In the chaos, she stumbled, and the doll flew from her hands, hitting the floor with a sharp crack. "Stay down!" Jonas roared, returning fire through a shattered window. But something had caught his eye. Something small and metallic that had fallen from the broken doll. Annie saw it too. Her eyes went wide. "Mama's locket," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "I thought it was lost. In the fire." "Open it!" Jonas said urgently, a sudden inexplicable feeling seizing him. A bullet splintered the doorframe inches from his head. "Quickly, Annie! Open it!" With trembling fingers, she fumbled with the tiny clasp. It sprang open. Inside, where a picture of a loved one should have been, was something else. Something far more dangerous. It was a tiny folded piece of paper. A photograph. Jonas's blood ran cold. The photograph showed two men shaking hands over a stack of legal documents. One was a younger Thomas Fitzgerald, Annie's father. The other man was Jonas. It was the day they'd signed their original partnership agreement. But that wasn't the part that made the world stop turning. In the background of the photo, standing half in shadow but perfectly clear, was a third man. A man watching them with cold, calculating eyes. Harrison Blackwood. "Annie," Jonas said, his voice tight. "Where did you get this locket?" "It was Mama's," she said, her eyes still locked on the impossible photograph. "She always wore it. She said it held the most important thing in the world." Her voice broke. "Papa gave it to me. Right before he died. He told me to keep it safe. He said it proved who I really was." 3 years of mystery and grief and guilt slammed into place with sickening clarity. Thomas Fitzgerald hadn't just been a partner. He had been a witness, and he had created proof. This locket, it wasn't just a keepsake. It was evidence. Evidence that linked Blackwood directly to the mining claim from the very beginning. Evidence that proved Blackwood knew about the silver long before he started his legal attacks. It proved he had a motive for murder. The gunfire outside intensified. They knew. Somehow they knew about the strongbox. They knew about the evidence. And this attack wasn't just to silence them. It was to destroy the proof. "They're trying to kill us," Jonas said, his mind racing. "And burn the evidence with us." Annie's face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a cold fire. "The strongbox, Mr. Redwood. The locket proves why they killed them. But the strongbox has the papers to prove how they did it. We have to get to it." He nodded grimly. She was right. The locket was the motive. The strongbox was the method. Together they were enough to hang Blackwood and his entire crew. A new sound cut through the chaos. The thunder of approaching horses moving fast. Jonas risked a look and felt a surge of adrenaline. It was Sheriff Murphy, leading a posse of armed townspeople, their faces grim in the flickering firelight. "Jonas!" The sheriff's voice boomed over the gunfire. "We saw the smoke from town! Hold on!" Caught between Jonas's rifle and the approaching posse, the attackers broke. They scrambled for their horses hidden in the trees. But one of them turned and hurled a final torch onto the cabin's roof. Even if they couldn't kill them, they would make sure the fire finished the job. Flames licked up the dry shingles. The roof was catching. "We have to go! Now!" Jonas yelled. He grabbed Annie, the precious locket, and the surveyor's map. Everything else, the home they had started to build, the fragile peace they had found, was consumed by the fire. They burst out of the flaming cabin just as the sheriff and his men rode up. The attackers had vanished into the night. "Thank God you're all right," Sheriff Murphy said, his relief palpable. Mrs. Brennan saw the flames and raised the alarm. As the townspeople formed a futile bucket brigade, the sheriff pulled Jonas aside. This wasn't random, was it? This was about those legal papers. Jonas held Annie tight, her small body trembling against his as they watched their home burn to the ground. It's about a lot more than papers, Sheriff, he said, his voice raw. We're dealing with men who've already murdered for this land, and they won't stop until everyone who knows the truth is dead. What do you need? The sheriff asked, his face set like stone. Jonas looked down at Annie. She was clutching the locket, her knuckles white, her expression a terrifying copy of her father's stubborn courage. A fast horse, Jonas said, and an escort. We have evidence that can bring Blackwood down, but we have to get it before he does. Sheriff Murphy looked at Jonas, and in the firelight he saw the man Jonas used to be, the man who stood for what was right. You're talking about justice for the Fitzgeralds, he said. I'm talking about justice for Annie, Jonas corrected, and for every other honest settler these men have ruined. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, they prepared to ride. The locket had changed everything. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for the truth. And somewhere out on the prairie, Harrison Blackwood was realizing that his perfect crime had just unraveled in the worst possible way. The heir had survived, and she had found a protector who was willing to burn the whole world down to keep her safe. The charred timbers of the cabin stood black against the morning sky, a monument to Blackwood's rage. Smoke still curled from the ashes. The people of Ember Creek gathered, not to gossip, but to help. Mrs. Brennan arrived with a wagon full of blankets and food. Doc Peterson brought his medical bag, his gentle face set with a grim resolve. Even Mrs. Hutchkins showed up with a basket of bread, muttering that no one deserved to be burned out of their home by murdering cowards. But it was Sheriff Murphy who brought the most valuable supplies. He carried a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth. I've been doing some digging of my own, the sheriff told Jonas and Annie. They sat around a small fire built from the remains of the fence. After Blackwood's visit, I sent some telegrams, asked some questions about mining claims. Annie looked up from the broken doll she was trying to piece back together. What did you find out? The sheriff's face was hard. I found out your father, Thomas Fitzgerald, filed the most legally perfect mining claim in the history of this territory. Every I dotted, every T crossed. It was ironclad. Jonas felt a surge of pride for his dead friend. Thomas was always thorough. He had to be, the sheriff continued. Because I also found out Harrison Blackwood has been doing this all over the territory, using forged papers and crooked judges to steal land from honest men. Annie's small hands clenched into fists. How many families has he ruined? Too many, the sheriff admitted. But here's the thing. Your father was smarter than all of them. He didn't just file his claim locally. He sent certified copies to the Federal Mining Bureau in Washington. He sent them to the territorial governor. He created a paper trail so wide and so deep, not even a snake like Blackwood could make it all disappear. Jonas looked at the papers the sheriff had brought. It was all there. Proof of ownership. Proof that Blackwood's claims were fraudulent. With these documents, the sheriff said, his voice low with satisfaction, and the evidence in that locket, we can expose his entire criminal empire. Doc Peterson, who was cleaning a burn on Jonas's arm, looked up. That's assuming we can get the evidence to an honest judge before Blackwood's men find us and kill us all. The cold reality silenced them. They had the truth, but they were trapped. What about the strongbox? Annie asked, her voice small but clear. Papa's strongbox has the original documents. It's still out there, Jonas said. But Blackwood's men will be watching. They'll be expecting us to go for it. Then we don't go alone, Doc Peterson said firmly. We take half the town with us. We make it a public spectacle. We make it impossible for them to act without witnesses. The sheriff nodded. Doc's right. This isn't just about recovering papers anymore. This is about making a stand. As the men planned, Annie worked on her doll. The wooden figure was cracked and scorched, but she fit the pieces back together with a determined patience. Jonas watched her, and he saw a perfect metaphor for their own lives. Broken, burned, but not destroyed. They could be rebuilt. "Annie," Jonas said gently, "what we're planning? It's dangerous. Blackwood will not let that strongbox go without a fight. If you want to walk away from this, I'll understand. I can get you somewhere safe." She looked up from her work, and in her eyes was the unyielding steel of her father. "Mr. Redwood, those men killed my parents. They burned our home. They tried to kill us." She held up the broken doll. "Some things are worth fighting for, even if it's scary." Jonas felt his heart swell. "In that case," he said, "we better be ready for a fight." The rest of the day was a blur of preparation. The sheriff gathered a posse of grim-faced farmers and shopkeepers, men who understood that if they didn't stop Blackwood here, he would eventually come for them too. Doc Peterson packed medical supplies. Jonas taught Annie things no 8-year-old should ever have to learn. How to recognize the sound of different rifles, how to use terrain for cover, how to load the small pistol the doctor insisted she carry. That evening, they camped in the ruins of their home. "When this is over," Annie said, applying a thin line of wood glue to a crack in her doll, "will we rebuild the cabin?" "Would you want to?" Jonas asked. She thought for a moment. "Maybe bigger, with a big kitchen, and a room just for me, and a workshop for you so you can carve things." The simple, hopeful vision of that future was the most powerful weapon Jonas had. "That sounds perfect," he said. "But you know, home isn't about the building, Annie. It's about the people you do anything to protect." She held up the mended doll. The lines of the repair were visible, but they were now part of its story. "I know," she said. "Home is wherever we're together." As they settled down to sleep under the stars, they both knew the truth. Tomorrow, they would ride out to get the strongbox, and it was very possible that not all of them would be coming back. In the distance, coyotes howled. But around their small fire, two people who had found a family in the ashes drew strength from each other, ready to face the battle that would decide everything. The dawn was gray and cold. The small posse rode out from the ruins, a strange collection of Avengers. Jonas, a child, a sheriff, a doctor, and a handful of farmers. They were heading for the lightning-scarred oak tree that held the key to their future. Annie rode beside Jonas, her father's old surveying compass hanging around her neck. She looked less like a child and more like a soldier marching into battle. "There," she said, pointing as they crested a hill. The massive, twisted oak stood alone in a clearing. It was a perfect landmark and a perfect trap. "I don't like it," Sheriff Murphy said, his eyes scanning the ridges surrounding the clearing. "Too open, too many places for an ambush." As if on cue, they appeared. A dozen riders, materializing on the ridge lines like ghosts. They were armed with rifles, and they had every escape route covered. At their head was Harrison Blackwood. He was done pretending. "Mr. Redwood," Blackwood's voice boomed across the clearing. "How convenient of you to lead me right to it. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jonas drew his rifle from its scabbard. Around him, the men of Ember Creek did the same. "The only thing I have, Blackwood," Jonas yelled back, "is the truth about what you did to the Fitzgeralds." Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of all humor. "Evidence? You're in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by my men. Even if you had evidence, who would you give it to? The courts I own? The politicians in my pocket?" Annie urged her horse forward. "I know who you are, Mr. Blackwood," she called out, her voice ringing with a strength that stunned everyone. "You're the man who murdered my parents." "Annie, stay back," Jonas hissed. But she kept going, her hand on the locket at her throat. "My papa kept records of everything. Every threat you made, every bribe you offered. He kept it all. And it's all in a box buried right under that tree." Blackwood's face darkened. He had underestimated the girl. He had underestimated them all. He raised his hand. Enough of this, he snarled. Kill them all. Burn the box. The world exploded in smoke and thunder. Jonas yanked Annie from her horse, diving for the cover of the massive oak tree as bullets ripped through the air where they had just been. Find cover, the sheriff roared. Make every shot count. The air filled with the whine of ricochets and the screams of men. Doc Peterson, surprisingly agile, was returning fire from behind a fallen log. Jonas! He yelled. The strong box! We have to get the strong box! Annie was already at the base of the tree, her hands scrabbling at the roots. It's here! Papa said 10 paces due north from the lightning scar, 3 feet deep. Jonas started digging with the small shovel they'd brought, his body shielding Annie's as bullets slammed into the ancient wood of the tree. The ground was hard, but after minutes of frantic digging, the shovel hit something metal with a dull thud. That's it! Annie cried. That's Papa's box! They heaved it from the ground, a heavy, waterproofed metal container. Just as they pulled it free, a bullet grazed Jonas's side, a hot, searing pain. They had the evidence. But they were pinned down, outnumbered, and running out of time. Blackwood's men were advancing, moving from cover to cover, tightening the noose. Mr. Redwood, Annie said, her face pale but her voice steady as she clutched the heavy box. Whatever happens, promise me you'll make sure the truth gets out. Jonas looked at this incredible child who had resurrected his soul. I promise, he said, but we are going to live to see it. We're both going to see you get what's rightfully yours. As Blackwood's men prepared for their final rush, a new sound cut through the gunfire. A bugle call, clear and sharp. Both sides froze. On the eastern ridge, a line of blue-coated cavalry appeared, the flag of the United States snapping in the wind. Federal Marshals! Sheriff Murphy yelled, his voice cracking with relief and triumph. A grim-faced U.S. Marshal with a silver star on his chest led 24 soldiers into the clearing. This is United States Marshal James Crawford, he bellowed. By order of the territorial governor, lay down your weapons! Blackwood's face was a mask of disbelief. Marshal! He called out, trying to regain control. I'm Harrison Blackwood. These people are trespassing on private property. Marshal Crawford dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice like chipping ice. I have a federal warrant for your arrest, for fraud, conspiracy, and the murders of Thomas and Sarah Fitzgerald. The color drained from Blackwood's face. That's impossible. You have forged documents and a history of violence, the marshal cut him off. We've been investigating you for months. The Fitzgerald case was the final nail in your coffin. He looked over at Annie, who was now standing holding the strongbox. His expression softened. Miss Fitzgerald, I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your father's meticulous records have been instrumental in our investigation. In a final, desperate act, Blackwood made a run for his horse. But his path was blocked by Doc Peterson, who held a Colt revolver with a surprisingly steady hand. I don't think so, Harrison, the doctor said quietly. You're going to face justice. The fight was over. As the marshals rounded up Blackwood and his men, Doc Peterson patched up Jonas's side. Annie, with trembling hands, opened the strongbox. It was all there. Every letter, every map, every fraudulent document Blackwood had ever created. And one last thing. A federal geological survey. Marshal Crawford whistled when he saw it. Good Lord, he said. According to this, Miss Fitzgerald, your father's claim contains enough silver to make you one of the wealthiest individuals in the entire territory. The news hung in the air. Annie wasn't just an orphan. She was an heiress. Jonas felt a mix of joy and fear. Her life would never be simple again. Mr. Redwood, Annie said quietly, reading his thoughts. This changes things, doesn't it? Now that I have all this, will you still want to be my guardian?" He knelt down, ignoring the pain in his side, and took her small hands in his. "Annie Mae Fitzgerald," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't ask to be your guardian because of any silver. I asked because you brought my life back from the dead. Wealth doesn't change that. Nothing changes that." Her smile was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She threw her arms around his neck. "Then we'll figure out what to do with all this money together," she whispered. Later that day, a military courier arrived with a telegram from the governor. It officially recognized Annie's inheritance and approved Jonas Redwood as her legal guardian. It was official. They were a family. As they rode back toward Ember Creek, toward the ruins of their cabin, Annie turned to him. "Mr. Redwood," she said, "when we rebuild our home, can we make it bigger? With room for other children? The ones who don't have anywhere else to go?" Jonas looked at this girl, with her boundless generosity and her unbreakable spirit, and he smiled. "I think," he said, "that's exactly what your parents would have wanted." 6 months later, a new home stood where the old one had burned. It was large and bright, with a huge kitchen and extra rooms for children in need. The Redwood Fitzgerald Home for Children, the newspapers called it. Jonas, his face now filled with a deep contentment, taught the orphaned children how to care for the horses. Annie, now almost 9, taught them how to read and bake bread from her mother's recipe book. One evening, after the children were asleep, they sat by the fire. "Do you ever think," Annie asked, "how different things would be if I hadn't knocked on your door?" "All the time," Jonas admitted. "I don't like to imagine what would have happened, to either of us." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I used to be scared you'd decide I was too much trouble." He wrapped his arm around her. "Annie, the day I became your guardian wasn't about trouble or money. It was about love, the kind of love that doesn't change." She smiled, content. "Maybe we taught each other," she said. On the mantelpiece, next to the old photo of Jonas and Helena, was a new one. It showed Jonas, Annie, and the 6 children they were now caring for. A new family, forged in fire and grief, and built on a foundation of justice and love. The most precious inheritance wasn't the silver buried in the ground, but the future they were building together, for anyone who needed a safe place to call home. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest of times, a little bit of courage can change the world, then make sure you're subscribed. And hit that like button to let us know you're out there. We've got another story coming tomorrow that you won't want to miss.